One, two, three. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Chalkboard History. It's version 2, volume 4, something like that. Right. It's like a Tennessee Historical Quarterly publication. It's volume 13, number 75, fall 1957. So try and put that into your footnotes. So today, we're going to talk about Tennessee's favorite son, Al Gore. Andrew Jackson.
Well, he does share in common with Al Gore that he didn't get to be elected president. So there's
it's the
accidental president.
Andy Johnson. Old Hickory Jr.
He wanted to be. I think he really idealized Andrew Jackson, but I don't know that it worked out like that.
So let's talk about Andrew Johnson and his role, not just in the history of Tennessee, but his important role in the history of the country.
You know, I think if you poll the average citizen on the street and you ask about, even in Tennessee really, and ask about Andrew Johnson, the one thing people seem to know about him is that he was the first president to be impeached. Mm-hmm. But that's not the most significant thing about him. I mean, he's a rags to riches story, just like Abraham Lincoln was, born poor, has to carve a life out for himself, apprenticed when he's like 14 to a tailor, runs away.
I have to remind myself of something, so keep going.
All right. So he and his brother run away from his apprenticeship. He eventually tries to buy it out. The guy is setting too high a price, so he just runs away again. But he is going to build a life for himself, initially as a tailor. What?
He was born one day after I was. Just like 160 years earlier.
Yeah.
December 29th, 1808, born in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Nice. Yeah. His dad was worked at various jobs, janitor, stable keeper. He was the guy who rings the bell when something scary happens. And when Johnson was 4, there was a canoe that overturned, and his father actually rescued the guys, but it put such a strain on his heart that just a few days later he died. So Johnson grew up without his father for the most part. His mom does remarry, but he's apprenticed out to this tailor and becomes a very good tailor, but that was not a job that was held in real high esteem back then. So he was an insecure person from day one, which I do think shapes his personality a little bit. And
so why is he important? Because he's born in North Carolina, he's from East Tennessee, he's poor, dad died, he's got, issues like we all do. Mm-hmm. But why is he really important? So he serves a decade in the Tennessee House. So he gets into politics early. Right. He's a senator. Mm-hmm. But it's really the war, not Lincoln, but it's the war that catapults Johnson onto the national scene. And you're right. A lot of people with Andrew Johnson, he's racist, and he was drunk, and he was impeached, and he's a bad president. Mm-hmm. Well, those are probably mostly all true. Mm-hmm. Except that's not just that shouldn't define, I think, anybody's life, whether you're talking about him or, frankly, we said earlier, if you're talking about Donald Trump, if you look at the impeachments of Johnson, Bill Clinton, and the first Trump impeachment, I think they're all a bunch of bogus political games that ultimately never led to convictions in the Senate. None of them really faced the music. It was a bunch of House politics that got them. They got in trouble, and then the House decided to punish them.
Find a way to get rid of them.
But it is because Johnson is a Unionist.
Yes.
Okay. He believed that secession was absolute craziness. He considered this treason, and he's the only senator. So of the 11 states, that means 22 senators who are in the Senate, all of them side with the Confederacy or got tossed out of office because, here's a quiz. Who's the other Tennessee senator? Andrew Johnson and?
Oh, snap. I don't know.
AOP Nicholson. Okay. Nicholson was from Murray County.
Okay.
And Nicholson got kicked out of the Senate in the summer of '61 for aiding and abetting the Confederacy.
Naturally.
But Johnson was
refuses to leave.
Bye-bye. So Johnson's the only one who stayed loyal.
Yeah.
So Lincoln had a VP, Hannibal Hamlin. Lincoln runs second time, and Johnson, who is now military governor of Tennessee, is selected as Lincoln's new running mate. And why? Why does Andy Johnson get the job?
Well, by the time Abraham Lincoln is running that second go around, we're nearing the end of the war. I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion yet, but Lincoln and the Republican Party, for that matter, are already looking ahead to...
And he's a Republican, and Johnson is
a Democrat.
Is a Democrat.
And he's a Southern Democrat, which brings breadth to the ticket, because Hannibal Hamlin's from the North. He doesn't really add anything. And so Johnson is a bit of a bridge. He's a bridge to Democrats. He's a bridge to the South. And he's a Unionist, so they can still rely on him to be a Unionist. He's not an abolitionist by any stretch of the imagination, but he is a Unionist, and so they're hoping that this builds some sort of consensus.
It's a little bit like Kennedy choosing LBJ 100 years later, even though they're in the same party. It is a bridge between North and South.
And nobody really thinks he's going to be president. I mean, they're not, I don't know how much they're thinking about that. They just need to get Lincoln reelected.
He wasn't thinking that he would be president.
No.
So let's go back a second. So Johnson, as military governor, he took over in early '62 as military governor because
after Nashville falls.
Nashville fell, and so Johnson, as the loyal Tennessee politician, gets the job. And as military governor, I'm not going to say that Johnson was ruthless, but he didn't take any crap. And one of the things that Johnson did, which actually ties to a story right here at Rippavilla and in Spring Hill, was they assessed monetary fines to people who either accosted, attacked, or killed U.S. soldiers. That's how William Briggs, the guy who gets killed here in the summer of '64, leads to all these financial levies on the local citizens, because what Johnson was doing, and his cronies, was they're trying to shake down local populations for intelligence that would lead them to find out who was killing U.S. soldiers. So I think it's an interesting part of Tennessee's history that often is forgotten. I mean, I didn't know about it until really the last couple of years. So then what happens? The war is almost at an end. I mean, technically, one big piece of the war's conclusion has happened. Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. And what happens a few days later?
Well, then Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And now, all of a sudden, Andrew Johnson, who was just supposed to be a compliment on the ticket, is going to ascend to the position of presidency.
Right. And not only was Lincoln assassinated, the Secretary of State was almost killed.
And Johnson was supposed to be. Right. He was on the list.
And the plan was to kill Johnson, because what the group, starting with Booth down through Davy Harold and the whole conspiratorial team, they were going to chop the head off the American government. And
start fresh. Clean house.
They didn't. But the only, what they were successful in doing was they killed the president.
To take out the most essential piece of that.
Right. And so Johnson is sworn in, and then really begins the period of time where Johnson truly becomes historic.
And, it's hard to know what Lincoln would have done there. I mean, it was a difficult position for anybody to be in. I think the one thing that we always saw through Lincoln's life in general, but particularly in his presidency, is he was constantly growing, and he was constantly expanding his view. So you can be optimistic and say he would have done something better, and he very well might have. But Johnson's left. Lincoln has declared an intent to be fairly gracious toward the South. I mean, that's what he's saying. He's saying that toward the end of the war. And Johnson, I think, in some ways believes he's carrying on what Lincoln would have done. The one thing that he's very punitive about, he does not like wealthy Southerners. He never has. I mean, he was a victim of their torment when he was a young kid growing up, and they looked down on him. And so he's got a bit of a grudge there, and he's going to play that out a little bit in the fact that any former Confederate who was a commander, held a high position in the military, who has a lot of money, like Nat Chairs, has to jump through a little hoop with him, because not only do they have to sign the oath of loyalty, they're going to have to get amnesty from him, and they have to appeal directly to him.
Yeah, so he really sticks it to people like Nat Chairs twice, because Chairs was a former Confederate, and there was this monetary line that if you were over it, you got it a second time, and Nat is part of that. Oh, well, I shouldn't say got it a second time. It's you. I think, though, in Johnson's eyes, you were the double villain.
Yeah.
Because you were not only a traitor, you were a wealthy guy that he didn't like. Mm-hmm. And so I said to you earlier, that's not really what a president's supposed to do. That's sort of what a king does. And Johnson has this amazing ability to make enemies. Mm-hmm. He's incredibly good at this. But Johnson had a very clear view of the country. He had a clear view of secession. He had a clear view of treason in his eyes. He had a clear view about race. What's not so clear is what was supposed to happen after the war. And I think that's what I think we need to get into, because we don't really know what Lincoln's policies were going to be, because they were never spelled out in any sort of written form other than bits and pieces. There's no congressional legislation. Johnson and Lincoln were not really that close. And I mean, they were only together in D.C. for about a month. But there's an important thing that happens before Lincoln's death and before the inauguration of Lincoln and then subsequently Johnson. When Johnson left Tennessee, there was an election here. And William Brownlow, or as some people call him, Parson Brownlow, another East Tennessee guy, also born in North Carolina, is elected governor. So Tennessee is the first former Confederate state that's really functioning with a civil government. In fact, it's functioning before the end of the war.
And Johnson helped that come about. While he was military governor in 1964, he set up the first civil elections here.
And Brownlow's clearly, he's handpicked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really is an election almost in name only. But we're going to get back to that, because a lot of people would immediately start complaining about how unfair this was. And that's a problem that plagues Johnson, because I think two things happen. You have Andrew Johnson as just this like force of nature, and this idea among many white people in Tennessee that the war's over and there's no real price to pay. There's no responsibility, there's no penance, there's no punishment, there's nothing. We'll just go back to the way that it was, except slavery is over. And both Johnson and Brownlow don't see it that way.
One of the views that Johnson had that very much aligned with Lincoln's is the fact that secession was not legal. And because it was not legal... Constitutional. Then the states that had left never really left. They were always still a part of the country.
This is a huge problem.
And he's going to roll back around to this. And certainly those southern states would have pushed back on that, at least during the war. But when the war is over, they're like, well, then, if we didn't really leave, we can just sort of slide back in and pick up where we left off. And he might have been fairly amenable to that, but the radical Republicans are give that a definite hell no. And so now they're going to have to jockey back and forth about what does a state need to do.
Okay, so let's define a radical Republican so everybody understands. These were Republicans that had been wary of Lincoln, who came from the more conservative wing of the party. Well, the radical Republicans, who were really abolitionists or anti-Confederates, and Lincoln had issues. Well, they immediately have issues with Johnson. But Johnson has immediate issues with Brownlow, because what happens in Tennessee, right as Nat Chairs is coming home, among thousands of other former Confederates, is the General Assembly passes the franchise law. And the franchise law is, I don't know if this is actually taught in Tennessee schools, so Jenny Peach, we need you to get on this if it's not. The franchise law disenfranchised anybody who had any connection to the Confederacy, whether you were a soldier or you just supported it. So the vast majority of white men in Tennessee could not vote.
Even a man like John McGavick, for example, we talked about, we don't know whether he...
I don't think, I can't say yes or no, but I believe the evidence is John was likely excluded as well. Nat Shares was, Fountain Branch Carter was,
But
Moscow
writes about, he writes a letter to Todd Carter,
Right.
and his brother, and he says, Johnson's made it so difficult to jump through the hoops here, it's hard to imagine anybody who can actually go.
But it's actually not Johnson.
Yeah, at that point it's Brownlow.
It's Brownlow. This is where they split, because Johnson he wanted to get Tennessee back in the Union. One thing is Johnson gets, I think, kind of libeled by people. He was a proud Tennessean, but he wanted Tennessean to be back as a functioning part of the United States. And so a big part of that wasn't ratifying the 13th Amendment, which was sort of pro forma. It was the 14th Amendment. And this gets us into this interesting period of time where the Ku Klux Klan emerges. Mm-hmm. So Tennessee ratifies the 14th Amendment, which gives civil rights to all citizens, all people, which means black people. Mm-hmm. And Johnson sees this as a step toward black suffrage. Mm-hmm. And this is where he and Brownlow split. And now Johnson, so there's two things. There's what's happening in Tennessee, and there's this huge struggle that's going on in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And there's literally like two proxy wars going on. When the General Assembly passed the new version of the franchise law in the spring of 1867, or late winter, February of 1867, and it gave black men the right to vote, all bets were off. Mm-hmm. And Johnson now finds himself quickly immersed in an impeachment proceeding, mm-hmm. and Tennessee is on fire. Mm-hmm. And I said this to you earlier, I had long wondered why the Ku Klux Klan why its origins were in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. Well, now I know why. Because Tennessee was doing something that no other former Confederate state was doing, and frankly, it was doing what some northern states hadn't done.
Right.
It was promoting real equality, bona fide civil rights, and all hell broke loose. Mm-hmm. And Johnson, I think, like a lot of people, sat back and didn't much care. Mm-hmm. And this is a legacy that we live with today because, for the Klan to be as powerful as it was in 67 and 68, which takes us to the end of Johnson's only term as president, right. and through his impeachment, is to understand its power was driven not just by racial animus or anti-Brownlow animus. It was that probably 5 or 10 times as many were in the Klan, mm-hmm. tacitly supported everything the Klan was doing. Mm-hmm. So what's happening in 67 and 68 in Tennessee?
Well, the Klan is active. I mean, we have Freedmen's Bureau schools that are being attacked. So it's not just people of color. It's people who are trying to help them move forward.
Like Henry Eddy.
In Spring Hill.
They're throwing rocks through his windows. They're intimidating the children and the parents.
Yeah. And Andrew Johnson is not doing anything to respond to this, and the Republicans in Congress are frustrated at him for a lot of reasons, and they would like to see him go away.
Right.
But he has to commit, the only way to get rid of him is to impeach him, and to be impeached, you have to have committed some sort of high crime and misdemeanor. Well, what exactly does that mean? That was left, I think, purposefully a little ambiguous. So they're like, well, let's create a law that we know he is bound to break, and if he breaks it, then we can impeach him.
And that was?
And that was the Tenure of Office Act. And it basically said, if you as the president want to remove, say, somebody from your cabinet, you need the approval of the Congress to do that.
Senate
approval specifically, which is hogwash. That bill is eventually overturned by the United States Supreme Court, who says it's unconstitutional. But in the meantime,
if you go to Johnson's home,
mm-hmm.
which is a national park site in Greenville, Tennessee, there is a plaque next to the tannery that talks about how it was overturned. And I mean, it was 70 years later. Mm-hmm. But Johnson was right. Mm-hmm. That law was unconstitutional. And so they laid the trap, and he walked right into it, not because he was stupid. Mm-hmm. Johnson was actually right. Mm-hmm. There was no constitutional basis whatsoever mm-hmm. to say that a president cannot fire or remove anyone from their cabinet.
Mm-hmm. But he does. He removes the Secretary of War. Edwin Stanton, and
who was an old Lincoln guy.
And he's going to try to smooth the path by putting Ulysses S. Grant in the position of the temporary Secretary of War, because he's the big hero right now, and
and Grant's like,
Grant's
like, no,
he's like, oh, this is no good. But of course, the Congress then, within days of Stanton's removal, have made up their list of
11 articles of
impeachment. And then they submit that to the Senate, and it goes to trial. And
well, in the House, it was really interesting how they did impeach him, because that civics lesson, ding, 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 is the impeachment is in the House and the trial is in the Senate. Mm-hmm. So they had 11 articles, and I think we've all heard that he survived, one vote in the Senate. Mm-hmm. Well, what happened is when the 11 articles ended up in the Senate, they only went through the first 3. Because the same guy who wouldn't budge, who they thought they might, he voted for acquittal all 3 times. And I think they realized 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 11 wasn't going to work. Right. So Johnson's sort of a wounded animal at that point. Grant runs that fall as the Republican. The Democrats don't even nominate Johnson.
Which was a huge disappointment, because he desperately wanted to be elected on his own merit. But
so the Democrats threw out Horatio Seymour, who was like cannon fodder. Grant won Tennessee. And Johnson, though, comes back. He runs for a House seat. He lost in 1972, but he eventually came back as a U.S. Senator and then died
shortly into that term.
Shortly into that term. I was just reading that he was going to take a trip up north and stopped at his daughter's home in Elizabethton, right? Okay. Yeah. And that's where he had a stroke. He must have been a tough son of a gun, because the stroke didn't disable him, and they didn't call for a doctor. And Johnson was like, I'll be okay. And then, boom, the second stroke. Oh. Now, the doctor probably couldn't have done anything, but he had to have 2 strokes, and then he died shortly thereafter. And I think, for a long time, I thought that Johnson was probably one of the 2 or 3 worst presidents. And I'm probably not going to elevate him, he's probably in the bottom 5 or 6. But he's not the simpleton kind of racist monster that he is often made out to be. But he is one thing. He is the kind of politician that never should have been president. Yeah. He was a good politician for his time.
And he did some good things. I mean, he wrote the first Homestead Act in 1846, and he really was a strong believer in creating opportunity for people who were poor, because he believed if you are a land owner, you have a vested interest in the country, and you're going to be a better citizen. And he wanted to create opportunity. And even leading up to the war, he's trying to suggest all these amendments. What if we elected the president and the vice president by popular vote? Do away with the
Electoral
College, which is still thrown around every now and then. What if we said...
Well, you know who was an early proponent of that? Was James K. Polk.
Okay.
Polk had suggested dropping the Electoral College 15 years before he was governor.
And these 2 guys didn't like each other, but I guess they agreed on that.
And he's pushing the Grange movement at the end of his life, which is still a real thing.
He bought us Alaska.
Right.
What's that?
Yeah, when Seward cut the deal when he was in Johnson's administration. So, yes, Johnson's, his major hang-up, other than his desire to fight with Republicans, was as a white Southerner, he just couldn't fathom giving civil rights to black people. Right. He was perfectly okay with slavery ending. He had owned slaves, but he saw that system as never really beneficial to much of the society and as a whole. So, but he just couldn't imagine black people voting, black men voting. He couldn't imagine sitting them on a jury, and he couldn't let it go. And that's a huge shortcoming, because he lived at a time when a lot of people were letting that go, but he was immensely popular. Tennesseans eventually brought him back to the Senate, and he's an interesting character just because he works in these 2 worlds. He's a Tennessean, but he's also operating on that higher plane, that national plane of what the United States was doing. So last thoughts about an East Tennessean who became president, who was the first to be impeached and, rose back to power.
Yeah. I think we pretty much covered it.
Well, if you have a chance, there's some really great bios on Johnson, but there's
one of the books that we sell that does talk about the impeachment itself. But one of the chapters in here is called Moses, and that's basically a bio. So if you want some really good information about Johnson, but if you also just want to explore the subtleties of his whole administration, really, and the whole impeachment movement and who the actors and players are, this is a really good book. It's available in our bookstore and online.
Well, I think we've said all we can about Andrew Johnson. Read about him, learn about him. It's always good to learn, especially these years right after the war, because they're so important. They so impact us today.
Right.
And Lincoln to Johnson to Grant, you're looking at 3 presidents, and you're seeing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the early struggles over the issue of the war and race and Reconstruction, and it doesn't seem very sexy, but it actually is extraordinarily so and very important. So take a chance and learn a little more about Andrew Johnson. Thanks, everybody.